All right, I hope you can hear me. My topic is related to the concept of common security, and of course it was a central concept for the OSCE or the Helsinki process, indirectly or more tacitly, but particularly for the OSCE since 1990. Here's a kind of a quick look at the basic contents of the concept. First, the idea is that there's some kind of a security dilemma. And this was implicit already in the Helsinki process itself, and perhaps a bit more explicit in the concept of common security, or much more explicit, that was developed in the 1980s and then became also the key concept of the OSCE in the Paris Charter of 1990. So the idea is that war can develop on the basis of the reactions of defensive states. So nobody intends to attack anyone, but there's a kind of a vicious circle of arms race and mutual suspicions that can actually lead to a war. And this problem was made much worse by the emergence and then development of nuclear weapons. So by 1975, there were tens of thousands of nuclear explosives in the world, and the world was on the brink of the end of the world. And this was the basic problem. Then from this, it was concluded that it is better to cooperate than to see the other states as rivals. And so we need some kind of a concept of cooperative security. And so this mutuality and the cooperative spirit is very much part of the concept of common security. I will go into the details quickly. This has some historical background. In the 1960s and 70s, many peace researchers, for instance, and peace movements as well, we are developing this kind of an idea about the cooperative security. This term itself was launched more or less by the Palme Commission in 1982. And there's one particular person, Egon Bahr, the West German member of the Commission and a former advisor to Willy Brandt, who has claimed credit for actually coining the term. But it doesn't matter, the concept already existed before the Commission itself. But it outlined it, it made it very famous, and it also used that particular term of common security. So according to the Palme Commission and its report from 1982, states cannot achieve security at each other's expense. Security must be achieved not against the adversary, but with them. This is, of course, a piece of advice that is highly relevant in the contemporary situation, as we already heard. The concept of common security in particular is also taken to mean that the deterrence must be replaced with some sort of cooperation. So instead of deterring the other from not attacking you, you need to cooperate with the other. So a key part of the concept of common security has to do with the incompatibility with the idea of deterrence. And the deterrence is the problem, and common security is proposed as the solution. The deterrence strategy, and particularly the mutually assured destruction of the 1970s, 1960s, and 1970s, was based on the idea that you need to assure the other party that in the event of some kind of an attack, it will be destroyed totally. And this, of course, made it possible that all kinds of reasons, including accidents and miscalculations, particularly in the context of crises of various sorts, I mean, that's a real possibility, and there have been many incidences like that in the world, plus irrational leaders might all provoke the start of a nuclear war. And this was the key problem for the Palme Commission as well. Their approach was very much based on classical liberalism in the sense that they advocated the idea of some sort of negotiations between states and formal agreements amongst them. But and this was widely criticized in the 1980s. I mean, famous security scholars like Barry Buse and now peace researchers like Johan Galtung very often criticized this aspect of the work of Palme Commission. If we look at what happened at the end of the Cold War, these formal agreements actually played a role, but in the context of many other processes. And the most important of these treaties was the 1987 INF treaty, in the medium-range missiles treaty, that was a kind of a turning point in the process that led to the end of the Cold War, and then also led to the Paris Charter as well, where the concept was actually first, for the first time, systematically introduced. It didn't appear in the Helsinki Final Act. There's only one mention of the concept of indivisible, but there's no mentioning of, and there's a lot of talk about cooperation, but there is no mentioning of the concept of common security as such. But in the Paris Charter, the terms cooperation and common became almost interchangeable, and it was also very often connected to the word of solidarity as well. And as we can see also, the term indivisibility appeared very often in the context of these two words as well. Security is indivisible, and the security of each participating state is inextricably linked to the security of all the others. And of course, there was a general thread that went through all these documents after the Paris Charter, namely that the whole idea is to work towards disarmament, especially in Europe, but also globally. And this quotation is very typical. This from the Paris Charter. The unprecedented reduction of armed forces brought about by the Treaty of Conventional Armed Forces in Europe and the new approaches to security and cooperation in the CSCE process mean a new concept of security in Europe and a new dimension in our relations. So that was the direction that things were supposed to take after the end of the Cold War, or at the end of the Cold War, because the Soviet Union in fact still existed when the Paris meeting took place. Here's a list of the practical steps that we are taking within the OSCE process. It included confidence and security building measures. Those were very much part of the Helsinki Final Act as well. It led to the establishment of Conflict Prevention Center. There were various field missions, very often monitoring either elections or human rights. There were all kinds of processes of mediation and dialogue. And there was also a new office that was responsible for developing democratic institutions and human rights as well. So this was the overall direction. There are two other concepts that are on a par with the common security and very closely connected to the concept of common security, namely comprehensive security and indivisible security. And they also have their own histories as well. The expression indivisible security didn't exist before the Second World War, but there was another concept that came very close, namely indivisible peace. And this was discussed by some scholars in the West, but it was also adopted by the foreign policy of the Soviet Union in the 1930s, before the final realpolitik and pragmatist turn of the late 1930s, when Molotov became the commissioner for foreign affairs, and that led to the infamous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The term indivisible, as I already mentioned, was mentioned once in the Helsinki Final Act in 1975, but it didn't have anything to do with this particular history, but rather it was about the inclusion of some parts of Europe that didn't take part in the actual Helsinki conference In particular, Yugoslavia at the time was very concerned about the exclusion of Albania from the treaty, and there were some other similar considerations as well. And then there was also the idea that the indivisibility also refers to the three baskets and how they are connected. The other concept, that comprehensive security, that appears several times in the Paris Charter, it refers to a broad and multidimensional understanding of security. And at first it was very closely connected to the idea of these three baskets. You need economic cooperation, then there's security cooperation, and finally there's this more culturally based set of things that included human rights as well. And but in the Paris Charter, it became defined more specifically in terms of human rights, democracy, and at least some socioeconomic conditions that we are very often, or at least working on, being connected to the idea of free markets. Now, there's a basic tension or contradiction within not only international law, but in the OSCE, and this is the tension between, or contradiction between individualism and collectivism. And both are needed in making a normative argument in international law, but they are nonetheless contradictory. So the concept of cooperative and common security expresses the more communitarian or collective side of things. That there's a community of some sort that exhibits certain kinds of values, and we can refer to those values and then try to enact them in our activities. But at the same time, there's also a strong emphasis on the basic and traditional principle of state sovereignty, which is the individualistic side, where the states are like individuals in liberal political theory, and the idea is that they are free to do, their freedom means that they can do whatever they want, including the arms build-up or military alliances, or creating or expanding military alliances, or even preparing for war. Only war itself is prohibited, but not the preparations for it. So there is a tension between the two. And as said, this also reflects the indeterminacy of international law in general. And this is also behind the discussions about the NATO enlargement in the West, including in this country. There has been a mantra that has been repeated time and again about the freedom of choice of sovereign states to do whatever they want in terms of their security arrangements. And this has implied and taken to imply that the states have the right to join NATO, and this is something that must stay unquestioned. And very often this is a mantra also in a sense, not only that it has been repeated time and again, but also because it very often is being repeated without much explicit consideration or in a rather unthinking manner. And this indeed is grounded on stressing only one aspect and problematic aspect of both the OSCE documents and international law, namely the state sovereignty aspect, ignoring the community side of things. And so it can be said to function as both as a rhetorical weapon and political justification for certain security and power arrangements in the world. And it also serves to silence any critical debate about alternatives and alternative security arrangements, including in Europe. Now, if there's a contradiction, it has to be, in order to make plausible normative judgments, we need some kind of a principle that is able to bridge the gap or at least alleviate the tension one way or the other. And my proposal is, and I think this is very close to the spirit of the OSCE, is to use the classical liberal principle developed by John Stuart Mills of no harm as the basis for thinking about how to reconcile the individualistic aspect and the communitarian aspect of the OSCE and international law more generally. The basic idea is that you're free to do whatever you want, unless what you're doing is causing harm to the others. Of course, this leads to the question about how to define harm, who is to determine what is harmful and what is not harmful. But we know the wider context also helps us to determine whether, for instance, NATO expansion has been harmful or whether it has not been harmful in this sense. And this context has included the continuation of the nuclear deterrence across or through the end of the Cold War. So in the 1990s and 2000s, the Russian Federation and the United States, we are still relying on the idea of mutually assured destruction. So the deterrence system was still in place. When Putin came to power in 2000, or late 1999, he soon also explored whether Russia could be considered as a future member of NATO. And then it was made very clear by the two different US presidents that this will never happen. And then because of various developments in the early 2000s, like the war in Iraq, the color revolutions, a number of other things, the trust between Russia and the West started to decline. And under those circumstances, it can be argued that NATO expansion started to be increasingly harmful. And so on this basis, we can make a judgment that this has been not only something that is not acceptable, but also has been a cause among many other things, because there are so many other processes that have affected the escalation of conflict between Russia and West. This is certainly not the only one. I mean, there are internal developments within Russia, including de-democratization, in places like Ukraine as well. All kinds of struggles. There are also like more local versions of the security security dilemma. And these are part of the wider security complex that includes also the West versus Russia. But I'm talking about what's happening in eastern Ukraine and the nearby areas. And then political economy developments. These terms have been very important in triggering, and in some cases reinforcing developments that have further aggravated the situation. Excuse me. So, for instance, the global financial crisis of 2008 and 9 that triggered the euro crisis was very important in creating the conditions for what is now known as the Euro-Maidan in Ukraine, that led also to the annexation of Crimea by Russia and the low-intensity war in eastern Ukraine. So all these things it's a complex process where there are many simultaneous processes that together have resulted in this particular situation. So NATO expansion has been a component in this wider context, but certainly not the only one. But still, my argument is that particularly as circumstances started to evolve in the 2000s, it started to be increasingly problematic and also harmful in the sense of John Stuart Mill. Now, if you look at things from the perspective of comprehensive security and the post-Cold War situation, I mean, there are a couple of things that can be said here. One has to do with political economy as well, namely that the idea of economic cooperation of the 1970s was translated into something that came very close to neoliberalism in the early 1990s, or in 1990 already. And this then was translated. This is, of course, not the fault of the OSCE itself, because I mean it has no bearing on the shock therapy in places like Russia or Ukraine, but it was associated with the same kinds of values and expressions, and it also took part in some of the processes indirectly as well. This shock therapy led to a total disaster in these places where it was implemented. In Russia, the industrial production declined to 10% of the times of the Soviet Union in the 1980s, and whereas the poverty rate of people living below the line of poverty in the late 1980s was about 2%. By the late 1990s, it was 40% in Russia. And similar other developments were quite important as well. Russia went through 2 phases of hyperinflation, which of course destroyed the basis of the everyday life of many people there. So by the late 1990s, there was a quest for a strong leader of some sort and strengthening of the state, and this paved the way for someone like Putin to rise and become become a leader that starts a new phase in the history of Russia. Of course, originally, I mean, it was very pragmatic policy that Putin and others were conducting, but this then evolved also in part due to the escalation of conflict with the West, but also because of the political economy developments and positioning of Russia in the world economy, etc., into increasingly authoritarian direction as well. So this neoliberal experiment was a total failure and has been a key cause of the things that we've been seeing ever since. The other interesting thing about applying the notion of comprehensive security in the OSCE concerns the idea of human rights and democracy, which has been used to justify interference in the political processes of a number of countries across the world, and not least in the former CIS region or in Central Eastern Europe. Many of these interferences have backlash, particularly those that have been more forceful, and they have included also military interventions as well. And the biggest of them obviously was the war against Iraq, that the idea was not only to replace the regime, but rebuild the democratic state by military means, which was of course a total failure as well. But it backlashed in many ways, not least through what happened in Russia. And but here what we see is interestingly a kind of a reversal of the roles of the different actors. Whereas in the case of NATO expansion, the West is playing the individualist card. And Russia is saying that collectively we have a community and we have certain basic norms, including indivisible security. Here, the West is playing the collective or community card, and Russia is playing the individualistic card. Namely, the West is saying we have a community of values, and those include democracy and human rights, and those justify our interference. And Russia is saying, no, we are a sovereign state and you can't interfere. And this is also quite interesting, I mean, given the contradictory nature of the OSCE and international law as well. Anyway, both of these processes that I mentioned, they have had various unintended consequences. This has been behind the process whereby Russia began to distance itself from the norms of the OSCE and the values of the OSCE, and very much behind that, those values we had this idea that I think was one of the most unthinking ideas ever, namely that the West won the Cold War, and that and it was precisely the neoliberal West that won the Cold War, and that this constitutes some kind of an end of history. And many of us were very critical of that idea already at the time, and nowadays it is quite common to acknowledge the failures of that idea, but many people do it in very Fukuyaman way, saying that the history has returned in the sense of power politics, and this because of human nature or something like that. I think the causes are actually much more concrete, and they have to do with particular policies that were implemented in the 1990s and later as well. On the other hand, these illegal, sometimes or quite often illegal interferences have backlashed as well, and there have been all kinds of criticisms of double standard, securitization of things like the color revolutions. So when there was the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, after that, it's my interpretation at least, perhaps Marco has some ideas about this, that in Russia this was securitized and they developed a kind of a strategy for in the event that something similar might happen again in Ukraine. And that the planning included also the annexation of Crimea. And when it happened again, in their interpretation in 2013 or early 14, that's what they did. And because they were concerned that the Sevastopol would become part of NATO as well. Okay, what can we learn from the Helsinki process? I think that the lessons of the original Helsinki process are again very relevant. The first is the idea of detente, and given the current situation and the concern about the future, I think what we need, at least to start with, is time. So in order to secure that time, we need confidence and security building measures. We are pretty much back to the square one in the sense that the developments that took place in the mid-1970s are again relevant. We have to start all over again. Of course, there are a number of differences between these two contexts, and what I have not been saying anything about are these other conflicts in the world. Russia versus the West is only one aspect of the overall global security complex. Those include China-US relations, the Middle Eastern security complex, etc. So, but even when we focus only on this conflict that is the most relevant from the point of view of the OSCE, it is very important to understand that despite all these differences between the situation of the 1970s, also in terms of the resources of different actors. I mean, Russia is a much smaller player in world politics now than the Soviet Union was in the 1960s or 70s. Simply in terms of population or economic resources or whatever. The NATO countries are like almost 10 times bigger, however you count it. Even the European NATO members constitute something like from 5 to 8 times the size of Russia in terms of population, in terms of less in terms of population, but I mean also in terms of population, but in particular in terms of economic resources, even military resources. And so there's a great asymmetry, but there are nuclear weapons. And in the context of the Ukrainian war, there's this one scenario that was laid out by the US intelligence, according to which in late 2022, when Russian forces were withdrawing in Ukraine, in the event that there would have been some kind of a breakdown of the front on the Russian side, and there would have been a threat to Crimea. They estimated, on the basis of the things that they heard the Russian generals and military planners discussing, of the use of nuclear weapons at 50%. So, I mean, the world was very close to a nuclear catastrophe at that point in time. But if you look at the more normalized situation and estimates, I mean, the per annum per year estimates vary. They are usually much less than 10%, sometimes only between 1 to 3%. But as said, this is, I mean, when we are talking about the occurrence of one event only, I mean, a lot depends on the concrete developments and what is the situation on the ground, how the crisis-prone the situation is from the point of view of different actors. Now, I want to make a note before going to the second part of the lessons of the Helsinki process on the inevitability of nuclear war. I mean, you may think that 1 or 2 or 3% per year is not a lot, but in fact, if there's even a slightly higher probability of nuclear war than 0, and that probability is not declining in a consistent manner. It is inevitable that there will be a nuclear war. It only takes time. And how much time it takes depends on what the actual probabilities are like. So with a constant 5% probability per year, it takes approximately 87 years for the probability to reach 99%. And it is about that amount of years since the beginning of the nuclear arms race in the 1950s. So we are already there. Obviously, this is not very realistic because the probabilities are much less in stable times. So if we simply assume that we vary, that 1 year is 0.1, the next year is 1%, then 5%, and 10%. I mean, depending on the year, there are crises and so on. It takes the 56 years to reach the probability of 90%, and 112 years to reach the probability of 99%. Of course, this might be an exaggeration as well, because the probabilities have been probably lower, and they are very hard to estimate anyway, because we are talking about a single event. Nonetheless, I mean, this is indicative of the nature of the problem, and why we also need more time. And time demands working out something that is very close to the spirit of the Helsinki process and the OSCE. What can we learn from the Helsinki process part 2? The point is also that we need time because of these other changes toward a more utopian, or I prefer the term utopian, direction. All transformations take time. And very often we are talking about global transformations. We need very often, even in the best of circumstances, we need at least 10 years for a single reform of some sort. And very often we need decades for a major transformation to occur. So that's the first thing. So we need de-escalation, we need confidence and security building measures and such like. Secondly, we need to somehow overcome the contradiction between the individualistic and communitarian aspects of both international law in general and the OSCE in particular. And I've suggested that the no-harm principle is a way of doing that in practical terms. It still requires contextual argumentation and judgment, but it's a way forward. So simply, instead of simply insisting either on the individualist or the communitarian aspect, we recognize them both and try to reconcile them in a reasonable way. The third, the point is to say that the Helsinki process itself, because it also contributed to the end of the Cold War, but also in the aftermath, I mean, particularly the more neoliberally inclined aspects of the OSCE have all kinds of unintended consequences. And we have to allow for those kinds of unintended consequences. Some of them might be good, some of them might be very problematic, but nonetheless, I mean, the idea is that we systematically try to work out scenarios about what kinds of unintended consequences may be following from particular the arrangements or actions. And we must be capable of learning from these. And I've suggested two the major lessons. The third, the one that I consider to be especially important has to do with these socioeconomic conditions and human rights that are very much part of the idea of comprehensive security, namely that there are different understandings of human rights. And again, there too, we need to make contextual judgments and allow for contradictions between different conceptions of human rights. I mean, for instance, there's a major contradiction between the more possessive human rights, including those that involve private property rights, particularly over the means of production or financial assets or whatever, and the idea of developing some sort of socio-economic egalitarian conditions for people to develop in a mutually reinforcing way. And indeed, the final lesson has to do with the consequences, the detrimental consequences of ignoring socio-economic equality and social security at the expense of many other things. This has been a major mistake that has had very far-reaching consequences, but there's nothing that cannot be remedied in the world. Thank you.